Thank you for coming. Sorry, may upuan ako medyo matagal yun po. Hi, can you hear me at the back? Okay. Yes? Yes. Okay. Hi, good afternoon. How are you? Okay, that shouldn't have happened. So, welcome to my talk. I'll be talking about my work and my process, and I hope it's going to be a bit of a long talk, but I hope it's interesting for everyone. So, how do you become a book designer? So, has everyone checked out the exhibits sa baba? Who has? Who has not? Okay, later. We'll have time. Okay, so how do you become a book designer? I didn't really plan this. I mean, when you're checking out the list of courses and what your parents say, book designer doesn't really come up in the choices. And when I was a kid, I really wanted to be a ton of other things. And looking back now, I can recall childhood fantasy occupations that were left by the wayside. Doctor, priest, can you imagine? Archaeologist, traveler. And in one of my favorite episodes of The Wonder Years, who watches The Wonder Years? Okay, nahalata na yung age. Kevin Arnold looks back at his childhood and he ruminates. And he says, when you're a little kid, you're a little bit of everything. Artist, scientist, athlete, scholar. And sometimes it seems like growing up is a process of giving those things up one by one. So for me, indeed, I could have pursued different trajectories in my childhood, developed other potentials, but now, with this exhibit as an impetus, I look back and I see a distinct thread connecting my childhood to my present. If we backtrack and examine my childhood, the foundations were laid, and fortunately, I had not been remiss in expounding on that thread. I am an artist and designer, yes, and underneath that, the foundation is I am a reader. So please let me introduce you to Carl Castro, a reader. Hello. When I was a kid, I was really into books. My mom was then working in an advertising agency, and whenever she'd have business trips abroad, she'd bring me back toys as pasalubong, but they would be used less than she'd expected. I was more interested in this complete tabletop set of flags of the world. As in yung pang desk ng boss. So I was such a nerd. Most of the time I'd be cooped up with the encyclopedia, and I was fortunate that we had several sets. There was a Collier's, which was very comprehensive. Who had Collier's? Kami Britannica. And then there was a Disney set, which was very nicely illustrated. Who had this Disney set? Wow. And then there was this Peanuts set. Who had this Peanuts set? Okay. And to this day, I still love Snoopy and the gang. And then we also had science encyclopedias, and then there were other encyclopedic resources like my mother's grandmother's collection of National Geographic magazine, who had these yellow things. And then Reader's Digest, back issues. Of course, ibang-iba pa yung itsura niya. Actually, I couldn't find a good picture, pero the ones I'm familiar with didn't even have any pictures inside. And then the Reader's Digest volume, Crafts and Hobbies. So most of the time, I would be devouring these things, reading about countries and their cultures, arts and crafts, flowers and plants, rocks and gemstones, archaeology and ancient places, disasters and tragedies, American history, world records, even random trivia. You name it, I read it. And as a kid, I discovered secondhand bookshops very early on. And until now, it's my usual haunt. My mother realized that she was better off buying me books than toys because they were my toys. So I discovered Nancy Drew in our library, also the Hardy Boys. Initially, the librarian recommended the Bobbsey Twins because I was around grade 1. But I found it too juvenile, di ba? Kapal na mukha. Pinatulang ko rin yung Sweet Valley Twins na mga kapatid ko, but I drew the line at Harlequin and Mills and Boone. So I discovered these cheaply priced illustrated abridged classics for kids, and I also discovered the sale bin. And new worlds were opening up to me, new ideas, and I reveled in them. From the encyclopedia, I discovered distant nations, their capitals, and their landmarks. From Nancy Drew, I discovered feminism and how an 18-year-old girl, empowered by her well-off class origin, can outsmart even the slyest of crooks and still make it to Sunday Mass. From Eyewitness Books, I discovered material culture and historical specificity. And from Crafts and Hobbies, I learned about different art techniques. And from National Geographic, I discovered the overlay of contemporary issues and ancient history. So after a while, I had amassed tons of books. Suki ako ng library namin sa Lasal. Ng bookstore, ng book sales, so I would be exposed to different kinds of books. Back then, the Dewey Decimal System was still in place, and the digital catalog was still in its infancy. So I was still free to roam around the shelves and pick at random to survey the spines and the covers and pull out what takes my fancy. One day it's a storybook, the other it's an Ikebana book, another day it was a calligraphy workbook. It was like meeting friends in different forms. Some were fat, some were thin, some were tiny, some were huge, some were fragile, and some were very sturdy. Some had lavish binding and jackets, and others were very Spartan. All of them, I began to sense, had their different functions, depending on the publication's message. So I guess that being a reader prepared me to be an artist and a designer. I was interfacing with ideas as well as with forms. Over the years, my interests grew with every book, and as every book hoarder can probably attest to, who's a book hoarder here? You know, we're in a library of it. When you live with books, they become home in more ways than you think. Here's a close-up of my bookshelf. Si Makala. On lazy afternoons, I would open a crafts book and make what my mom would look at as kala. Origami, historical maps, calligraphy attempts, mauubos ko yung reams and reams of art paper and bond paper. And sometimes when I draw, I would get a large book and I would use it as a drawing table on the bed. When I got interested in pressing flowers and leaves, the encyclopedia was my friend. And that was also how I learned that plant juices will damage the pages. So I learned to sandwich them in between newsprint. The books would also act as side tables, drink coasters, imaginary terrain when playing with toys. They would also be trophies to share with friends. They would make a room look nice when they were arranged neatly on the shelf, not unlike that one. They were vaults where I could hide money in. And they were presses where I could flatten bookmarks or other documents needed flattening in. They were image banks from which I could trace or photocopy images from. And they were weights that I used to flatten other books newly covered in plastic. So books became not just sets of ideas, but also physical and functional objects. And from this general bibliophilic odyssey, I would probably highlight 3 important phases, which I think contributed greatly to my practice today. One would be my calligraphy phase. My memory is terrible, and I do not remember if it was at home with my eldest sister's college speedball books, or if it was at the LaSalle Green Hills grade school library that I first encountered calligraphy. Either way, I discovered them around the same time, and I was quite taken with the world of beautiful writing. LaSalle. Is this style of writing familiar to me? I was dissatisfied with the Palmer-style script imposed on us LaSalle. And it was weird to me why we should all have the same handwriting, but there were so many more ways to go about it. I don't know if schools today still teach handwriting because everyone's handwriting seems pretty horrible now. But I did appreciate, however, the rigor, even if I sucked at it. And through these books on calligraphy, I discovered the history of writing. From cuneiform to Roman columns to the Lindisfarne Gospels, to Edward Johnston and movable type and digital type. And this particular thread, the history of calligraphy blending into the history of typography, it blended well with my interest in history and world cultures in general. So definitely early on, I already had a good grasp of the historical context of the fonts that I would see in the drop-down menu of Microsoft Word. So I learned that the written or printed word was essential to the dynamics of history and culture. And take note, I was maybe around grade 3 or 4. And the second phase would be my Filipiniana phase. And I'll admit it, Englishero ako ng bata. I was a Lasallian and a voracious reader of Archie comics. Who likes Archie? Okay. And I would throw around phrases like nincompoop and jalopy and not realize that I sounded like a completely privileged dork. And years later, when I would be studying visual arts at the Philippine High School for the Arts, there was a big shift in the books that were shaping my consciousness. For one, I was thrust into a scene, and Faye would know this because we went to the same school. I was thrust into a scene where my classmates spoke various regional languages and where the Englisheros were the minority. In addition, ours was a rigorous curriculum which probably fed my workaholic tendency. In our school, regular academics were in the morning, as in 7 to 12, and arts classes all afternoon, around 2 to 6. And all evening, we would cram for both. So teachers walk us through new techniques, ideas, and art movements. My social studies teacher, Ms. Jody Badon, thank you, ma'am, made us read Rolando Tolentino's Richard Gomez at Ang Mito ng Pagkalala, which was an eye-opener to me, not only on media literacy and, that you can read things other than books as cultural text. It was also an eye-opener on reading in Filipino, and as who's familiar with Rolando Tolentino's? Well, you should read it because he has a very particular style of writing in Filipino. Anyway, this is a really excellent book, and I would recommend it to anyone if you can still find it. So indeed, our library was small, but rich in Filipino. And our librarians also sold really yummy banana cake. But beyond that, and the aircon, and subscriptions to arts magazines, there were also, of course, the books. And here I discovered complete sets of the CCP Encyclopedia. Who's familiar with the CCP Encyclopedia? I hope more people become familiar with it. They're coming out with a new edition very soon. Alfredo Ross's 10-volume Filipino Heritage, The Making of a Nation, which is accessible at the Filipinas Heritage Library, if you want. There's also another 10-volume Saysayan, The Story of the Filipino People. And there were very exquisite books on culture published by Gilda Cordero Fernando. There were also rare copies of other Filipino novels and poetry books, and many other gems of Filipiniana. And in a way, this eroded my sheltered middle-class exposure, and I underwent a sort of Filipinization. So I realized books were a way to locate yourself in time and space. The third phase that I would like to highlight would be what maybe we can call my critical phase. That is when I entered UP. This is our main library. Who's familiar with the main library of UP? Did it look like this in Abu Dhabi? Okay. So when I entered UP, books ceased to be buddies or politely coexisting community members. I was thrust into the real world, and books were friends, but they were also weapons. So discursive battles were being waged here and there, and suddenly you had to be aware of where you were in the battlefield, on which side you stood, who was the enemy and who was the foe. And this was no longer the Duke Nukem or Doom or Warcraft of my childhood. This was my everyday landscape. And in classes, heroes were taken down, seemingly innocent spaces were demystified, the rose-tinted cloak was removed. And in their place, I began to see the ideology of things and how everything was subsumed by it. It was not an easy awakening because suddenly, nothing seemed innocent anymore. And from black and white, everything turned into shades of gray. I was exposed to literary theory, film criticism, sociology, Marxism, writings from the margins, and a whole plethora of difficult theorists na nakaka-nosebleed, mga librong nangangain ng tama, mga tekstong ilang beses mo kailangang pasadahan bago mo masimulang unawain. And I know we studied the Noli and Fili back in high school, but I had not really been able to deeply comprehend their value. In UP, I finally understood Simon's dilemma and Rizal's genius. Books were not just mute tomes, they also had the capacity to be volatile and incendiary. In UP, I also came to understand Bonifacio's genius, that history was written not only in books, but also in the outside world. Books can change the way people look at the world, but only people themselves can actually change the world. So I would admit, in the months leading to this exhibit, I was worried about many things. Here's a random exhibit shot. First of all, I was worried about being exposed. My friends would know, and they're in the audience right now, that I am a very hermetic person. Hindi ako madaling makontak. I am uncomfortable in the limelight, and I am terrible at public speaking. Sorry po. And I refuse to inflict the minutiae of my everyday life onto everyone. I don't want to share what I eat, what I wear, what I'm watching or doing or thinking to an imagined audience. I love my privacy, I love the secret life. Yes, naipasok ko yung title next week. And as a corollary, I'm a terrible social media person. Kung di dahil sa exhibit na to, my Facebook and Instagram would be as inactive as the Taal will be. Second, I was worried about confusing people. If I project myself as a designer, would that bite me in the ass when I decide to project myself as an artist? In our world today, people are taught to be personal brands. And this market logic is violent. You have to flatten your public persona into an easily understood index. And you have to stick to one thing so you don't confuse people. And I reject this consumerist worldview. People are complex beings. And we are not brands. In fact, the irony is that brands are trying to become people. Watch TV and all these big brands are harping on humanistic values, the human touch, the vulnerable emotion. Advertising today is an effort to mask the specter of commerce by conjuring the illusion of a heart. And the thing is, I know I am not a brand, but an audience saturated in consumerist discourse will probably see me through that lens. So there is a grain of truth to this don't confuse people approach. Designers often have a hard time expressing the personal or the subconscious, or whatever it is that's not initiated by an external prompt, like a client brief or a copywriter's headline. In a field that values clarity and the unequivocal, designers can be paralyzed by art, because art's power is largely buttressed by the power of ambiguity. On the other side of the coin, artists often have a difficult time stepping out of their internal labyrinths. Art is sometimes incongruous with the exactitude and deliberate discipline that the field of design demands. When you're exploring your inner world, it's hard to respond to the specific problems of others or to be bothered with clarity and communication. And that is the core of design. As a consequence, it is hard to expect good artists to become good designers, and vice versa. If an artist does design, more often than not, it's the merchandisation of their aesthetic and not the actual engagement of design problems. And if a designer does art, it may seem like a mere hobby or visual exercise, as opposed to a valid mode of inquiry. In mounting this exhibit, however, there were, on my part, some surprising realizations. Normally, I'm used to getting feedback on my work as part of the design process. But having people talk about my work or approach per se, it surprised me how authors and colleagues talked about artistic flourish and temperament. Here I was thinking na I was a diligent and reliable designer. Tapos malaman-laman ko lang na mercurial and pa-art pala yung tingin sa akin. Yeah. And in revisiting my work for the past decade or so, I realized that while I've been strict about looking at books and design, it also became clear that I was using techniques and borrowing ideas and references from art and cinema, and there were snatches of painting, of photography, of sculpture, of ephemeral art, and the pool of ideas was the same, only the output was different. So let me cite a few examples. Let's go to photography, and under photography, the print. For years now, I've been toying with the idea of photographic printing on leaves. Without divulging the process, the idea is to use the leaf's inherent chlorophyll as ink. A print like this is extremely fragile compared to more traditional prints like silver gelatin or chromogenic prints. I like the idea of an impermanent and ephemeral photograph, one that is as delicate as a biological specimen. I first exhibited pieces of this sort in a group exhibit of UP Film Institute graduates, curated by Yason Banal. So I used this technique in initial studies, cover studies for Alan Popa's poetry collection, Basta. And this study you can see downstairs in the exhibit. There was a fragility to the poetry that I tried to capture by making leaf prints. Some with just an image, some with just type. And this example you can see downstairs. None of this is photoshopped. These are real leaves which were scanned as is. However, we ended up taking a different approach altogether, sorry. But I find this study quite interesting. Next. Under photography, the documentary image. I've been taking photographs on public transportation for a while. Last year, some of my GP photographs were workshopped and shown as part of Thousand Folds inaugural Photo Semana Manila, which is a week-long micro-festival of contemporary photography. The workshop was facilitated by Spanish artist and curator Nicolas Combaro, and our final output was a slideshow. Let me share with you this slideshow so you get a better idea of this series and explore. So, my fascination for everyday scenery has, of course, turned up in my book designs. An initial study for Simeon Dimdum Jr.'s collection of essays on faith, called A Wilderness, made me think of these pictures because he describes faith in such ordinary terms and settings, and not the grand apparitions of the Bible, but God in the everyday. I proposed covers with my photos of religious imagery on the dashboard, which is on the left. This was rejected in favor of a more generic photo of Jew on grass, taken by the author's priest friend. I wasn't a great fan of the image, but the idea was still there, so there you go. Years later, I had a chance to revisit the idea for the cover. For a special double issue of the Philippine Studies on Filipino Catholicism, guest edited by Jael Cornelio. The idea was similar, how religiosity found its way into the Philippine vernacular. I wasn't able to take photos of some great religious jeepney art, which was my first choice. So I settled for this rather pensive image of an FX rear view mirror with a rosary, a God Bless Our Trip decal, and a sticker of Jesus with a crown of thorns. The peeling ceiling reminded me of clouds and made the image all the more third world. One of the contributors, Julius Bautista, also pointed out that the mirror is a very meaningful element, connoting reflection and bringing the passenger into the frame. The issue is available downstairs if you want. There's a Philippine Studies booth below. And if I may promote, please consider subscribing to Philippine Studies. It's been around since 1953, and it's still going strong, and for a good reason. It's a great read, and think of it as a magazine without the artistas making you feel ugly and without pitching at your insecurities to make you buy clothes or beauty products. It's just interesting tidbits on Philippine discourse. So sulit yan, promise. Let's go to textile. I love textile, and if anyone has seen my exhibit, you will kind of notice that I do like textile. In my forthcoming exhibit later this year at the Jorge V. Vargas Museum, I'll be working with textile as a medium. My starting point of inquiry is that traditional textiles incorporate motifs from the environment, like people, animals, plants, landscapes. And I were to start making textiles that reflect the current landscape, what would it be like? I borrow images from commerce, ephemeral images from online video feeds, and translate them into these rather laborious woven beaded tapestries made of glass, plastic, wood, and shell. And yes, I make these, and sometimes I feel like a crazy person doing it all afternoon. Come see the show this November, mark your calendars. So I love textiles, and I think if you've seen the exhibit, it's fairly evident. Two of the examples I chose are inspired by weaving. This is A Very Far Place, which is based on the Tawi-Tawi art of mat weaving, and the book Reka from the Diliman to the Cordilleras, which is based on Kalinga textile. Here's a shot of the exhibit, so you can check it out yourself. The original chapbook created as a tribute to NPA martyr Reka Noel Monte had a photo of actual textile on it. The connection was there, but it wasn't fleshed out. So I wanted to highlight the integration of Reka into the community, how she wove herself into the fabric of the communities she chose to serve. I did this by focusing on the Kalinga mata-mata, which is a subtle diamond quill weave. A fine example of which was graciously lent by Gallery Davis for this exhibit. It's at Bridge Lamp on the left. So, I took the mata-mata and recreated it in Adobe Illustrator bit by bit in order to weave Reka's portrait into the cloth. The title is woven in as well, and I repeated this motif in the inside covers and dividers. So wait, you can check. Next is film. People are often surprised to find out that I was a film graduate. Usually people assume I studied journalism or fine arts. But I love cinema and I still plan on exploring the medium someday. For now, my participation in cinema has been mostly movie posters. Pero darating din tayo dyan. I've described making books as similar to making films. When making a book, just like a film, you need to be aware of the pace of the narrative, the visual motifs, the timing of relaying or holding back the information for maximum effect. And I will cite 2 examples of book designs that benefited heavily from my understanding of the language of film. The first is an interesting cover treatment, Exi Agola's Trafficking in Nostalgia. Who has read this? It's published by the Ateneo University Press, and it's a good. It won the Gintong Aklat Award, which means it is not only the content that is good, but also the design and production of the book as a physical object. The Gintong Aklat Award is a publisher's prize, so it awards the book as an overall thing. And I was quite pleased knowing this, because that is high praise for a book with a black and white cover and whose inside pages were printed on newsprint. The cover itself is pretty plain. It is white, and there is a correlation between the word nostalgia and the baby picture, which you may safely assume is the author. I play here with the idea of memory. It is not static, it is flexible, it is something that you engage in with every recollection. So the plain white flap is obviously obscuring the photo of a child, and this invites you to open the flap to see what else is underneath. When you open it, there isn't actually much underneath. You see the child playing beside the gate, but at the end of the fold is a passage from the introduction. Is it readable from the back? So the passage on the right side is an excerpt from the introduction, and it says, nostalgia, the ache for home, the nostalgia of writing, the ache for a home to which one cannot return, the act of utterance, the journey and the destination. What we cannot retrieve, we revive in the act of writing, hoping it will live on in our words. If we cannot return home, we build a new one, hoping it will suffice. And suddenly it makes sense. The boy, the author, is he inside or outside of the gate? The innocent look on his face becomes one of quiet terror. Did we, the viewer, intrude on his playing? Is the ache for a home for which the boy, is this the ache for a home from which the boy is locked out? Or a time to which the boy, no longer a boy, can no longer return? Just by interacting with the cover, the viewer is already hooked, complicit in the uncovering of the image and the discovery of that little quote. And my goal with this design was to hook the browsing reader through curiosity, like opening an old cabinet in the attic, and to activate the seemingly innocent photo into something that can speak much more. It's like a good opening credits, tantalizing, engaging, leaving you wanting for more. In the inside pages, I used extreme close-ups of the same image, almost abstracting the photo. The dappled shadows on the pavement becomes, what is it? Clouds, ocean, sand. The plant box becomes a dark and leering recess. So everything is almost Rorschach. And isn't this the enigma of memory? That's the first book. The other book I will cite as influenced by cinema is, appropriately, about cinema itself. Ricky Lee's Sa Puso ng Himala. Who's seen Himala? More people should see Himala. There's a newly restored version out in the market, so please grab a copy. I read the manuscripts on jeep and bus rides, and Ricky Lee here emerges as a masterful non-fiction writer and editor. The story of the production of Himala is told through the words of the crew themselves. and reading it was like watching a documentary. I was challenged to capture this frantic and freewheeling pace using images and design. I had to be aware of what people had to hear alongside what they were seeing, what data was being presented. I had to be aware of little visual cues and motifs that would change the mood or the pace. I had to be aware of how the design's interplay of structured and unstructured would affect the subliminal feel of reading. Looking back, parang na rin akong gumawa ng documentary. So first of all, I wanted to draw from the existing palette of Himala. Old-fashioned as it is, because this movie was made in 1982, I used for headlines the typeface used in the original titles of the film. I also used a palette of cyan and purple, which is a nod to the beautiful film poster designed by Cesar Fernando. The title page is a reference to this, the first shot in the film, which is an eclipse. This is the title page that I made. And then I set off doing the pages. Some pages are like this. They were very structured and simple. Some pages were a little more crazy. This is an interview on Laura Ano. And then here's some more pages. Some pages were in full color, some were in duotone, cyan and black. There's a special section on the iconic scene, and there was a copy of the script. Also, this is from the making of the iconic scene. Involves a cast of thousands, and Ishmael Bernal knew he had to get it in one take, so he made a very detailed shot list of everything. We don't also just delve into the film's past, we also document the ripples it left in its wake, the influence it cast on the future. Here, gay impersonator, mimicking the lead character and Reed. And the awards kept winning, the memes it kept spawning. And this is a shot from the film where Elsa, the lead character, sees an apparition of the Virgin Mary. And this is that same spot now. So there is an English translation of the script. And it is this transition to the present, or visiting of the film by its main actress, and the shot of the sand dunes now green and alive. It's also from the actual documentary film by Keith Tikat and Sari Dalet that came with the story. So it transitions from present to the past. So making this book really felt like filmmaking for me. Number 4, installation. So I'm a fan of site-specific art, of ephemeral art. And one of the artists I admire is Andy Goldsworthy, who is a British artist who works with Earth, making installations and taking photographs of assemblages that capture the fragility of nature, physicalizing time. Well, I haven't quite explored this medium personally, I realized that in small doses, I've been applying this sensibility to book design. Again, 2 examples. The first is the new edition of the classic tome, Jesuits in the Philippines. By tome, I mean super kapal niya. The inside pages was more of a challenge on how to make it compact and readable at the same time. To fit a ton of words into the least amount of space without sacrificing legibility. But for the cover, it was a challenge. It's ancient history, and how do you make it interesting, or at least eye-catching? So I didn't want to do a historical etching, lest it be dismissed as another boring book on the medieval era. I didn't want to draw attention to particular people or saints. I wanted to focus on a more abstract level, colonialism or evangelism, indoctrination or integration. The story of the Jesuits in the Philippines is complex, and I wanted the reader to be able to approach it on their own, to draw their own conclusions. So I decided I wanted pure shapes and forms. My idea was a parallel between the symbol of the Jesuits, here, the solar rays ensconcing Jesus at the center, like a monstrance, and the symbol of the Philippines, the national flag. The cover, to be blunt about it, is a hybrid of the Jesuit sun and the Philippine flag. Jesuits. So, granting the blue, red, and yellow tricolor was only conceived way after 1768, but the contemporary reader will understand that the participation of the Jesuits in the 16th century had an impact on the history that led to the formation of the nation. So, how is this installation? Hindi ba to vector? Nope, hindi to vector. These are paper cutouts arranged on different levels. You don't see it, but underneath these cutouts is an assortment of canisters, masking tape rolls, a KFC gravy cup, ganyan. I just grabbed whatever circular things I had in my studio that had that. And all in, it was a weird tower, like about this high, a foot high. Hindi naman na that. Looks flat. And I needed to create the shadows, so height was necessary. And as background, I needed a royal blue field. Wala akong blue cartolina at hand, so I remembered that I had a polo in the exact shade that I wanted. And I stretched the back over a canvas and plucked the whole tower there. So why go through all this trouble? Vector is nice, but too clean. And there's a human touch that is a hassle to simulate in digital. I wanted the subtle gradations in color, the slight imperfections of alignment, the slight variety in the cutouts, the texture of the paper and the cloth, the interesting way light creates shadows. And as I said in the exhibit below, I value discipline, and I'm not a fan of photoshopping when you can capture it in Canva. Here's another study I tried, but it didn't work. Pangit yung kulay. So here's the final cover. It is bright, and I hope it is eye-catching. I made the rays extend on the spine a little bit, so you really feel the three-dimensionality of the book. Also, I'm happy that the spine was so thick that I can set the title horizontal, which is rare for me. So, another title is in the exhibit already downstairs. Maria Isabel Garcia's 21 grams of spirit and 7 ounces of desire. She problematizes science's penchant for measures and exactitude, and tries to reconcile it with humanity, art, and meaning. Somewhere in the interaction of those things lies life. One thing I wanted to use was a ruler. Sabi nga sa Rent, how do you measure a year in the life of a man? In daylights, in sunsets, in midnights, in cups of coffee, in inches and miles, in laughter and strife. So, I wanted to put a ruler. Here's how the inside pages look. May ruler talaga. Throughout the book, the foredge is a ruler, and the essay titles appear vertically. If I remember correctly, it's a real ruler, and that in a bind you can use to measure. It's in the centimeter scale. But what I also wanted the reader to feel was, here you are, you have 100 rulers, and in the course of reading, it makes you think, how useful is measurement really? On the cover, the ruler makes an appearance as well. The little countdown is a pun on the title. And again, the problemathy, what function does the measurement really play in our life? Does the soul really weigh 7 ounces? Come on. The cover image is trickier, I'll admit. And I feel a little embarrassed to show you this this iteration, and that I began with a completely different idea. Alongside the rules, I wanted a smattering of numbers. I cut out a ton of numbers from construction paper, enough to supply a small public school's bulletin boards. Effort. Um, but I wanted to show numbers as physical things, as things you look at, as things you can scatter, even set aside or dispose of. I took pictures, but none of it worked. None of it. So overkill. May rulers na, may numbers pa. It was too intellectual in the sense that they activated that mode of thinking where you thought of them as numbers. The cover had to be something more evocative, something more intangible. After all, the title is taken from an essay where there was a scientist who tried to weigh the soul. And what he did was he measured the weight of a person before and right after death. And he noted there was a 7-ounce difference. So conclusion niya, the soul weighed 7 ounces. So goodbye to these numbers. I decided on something less numerical. I wanted to make an ephemeral installation, and I figured the cheapest granular material would be salt and coffee because we had it at home. So this would allow me also a nice visual contrast of dark and light. So I took a large sheet of paper, which would translate into like a middle gray value. Then I spread salt and coffee on it to create the portrait of a woman. And then, after documenting it, I disturbed it a little, little by little, until the particles were no longer a woman, but just grains. And I think this really communicated a dimension of the book, which argues, is the whole really the sum of its parts? By the laws of measurement, the answer would be yes. But here, with the cover, it's not. Both the front and the back covers are just grains of salt and coffee, the exact same amount. But on the front, there's a human presence. And I guess in a way, that is what the author is trying to pinpoint, the intangible humanity that is unmeasurable and yet is undeniable. I could go on and on. I've made a ton of books and publications, and I do not want to count them. But in the process of making the exhibit, I estimate that I've made more than 100. And there is a story to each of these books. Some of them are inspirational, some of them are educational, some of them are horror. But to those who wanted to know how I make grids, how I select fonts and organize layers and styles, I'm sorry to disappoint you. These things I will not tackle today. But I would be happy to tackle them in future workshops. Yes, technical knowledge and craft is important. One should know the tools and techniques of the trade. And you are only as empowered as your InDesign or photography or drawing skill. But the most important thing is the eye. If there is one thing I would like to emphasize, it is this. You have to hone how you see things, how you read the world, how you discern truth from hype, substance from fluff, beauty from the trash. The past examples I cited would hopefully attest to the complicated process of reaffirming and rejecting aspects of a text, emphasizing or downplaying certain qualities of the material, making informed decisions on what technique or format to use, depending on the spirit and context of the book. These decisions are all founded on one's ability to read. You can be the best Adobe user in town, but what use is your skill if you have no vision? And the hand creates, but it is the eye that fashions. And how do you hone your eye? Always by looking, by seeing, and by reading. Thank you and good afternoon.